In this video, we will talk about exception handling in Java. After this module, you should be able to explain the term exception. You should also be able to distinguish between checked and unchecked exceptions. You should be able to throw exceptions, catch exception, create your own exception, which are called user-defined exceptions. But first of all, let's talk about the term exception. What does it mean? So in general, an exception is an event that occurs in a program which could cause what's called unreliable behavior. In Java, exceptions are associated with predefined exception classes, and we will see some of those in the upcoming examples. Now, throwing an exception in Java happens when the Java runtime environment detects an exception, like for example, division by 0, or when you're trying to traverse a string and you reach the end of the string and then you try to do some kind of traversal beyond the length of the string. It will also create an object of the associated exception class. So it's going to create an object based on what exception occurred. And then you can do some things with that object. You can retrieve a detailed error message, print a stack trace, and so on. Now, all exception classes will inherit from a class that's called throwable class. And this is going to be the structure of inheritance. So we have throwable, and then we have two classes inheriting from that, being error and exception. From exception, we have IO exception and runtime exception. So IO exception is something like file not found exception, which is something that we are going to see in the next chapter. Runtime exception can have something like number format exception, index array out of bound exception. You can have arithmetic exceptions, and we will see some examples on those. Now, we said we want to know the difference between checked and unchecked exceptions. So the checked exception is something that's going to be caught at compile time. For example, if you define a variable, let's say integer x, and then you don't initialize it, then you come in and try to use that x in some kind of print statement or some kind of arithmetic calculation. The compiler will catch that and will present it to you as an error, although it's not a syntax error, but it's kind of an exception because the value of that is null. Now, on the other hand, we have the unchecked exception. Now, these will happen at runtime, so your code is going to compile just fine. There's not going to be any problem with the code. And then when you run the application, you will get the error, which is the exception. For example, if you divide by 0. If you write a code to divide by 0, it's going to compile, but when you run it, you will get an exception. Now, this is, again, not going to be caught or handled by the compiler, but need to be caught and handled by the programmer. So, what happens when a program generates an exception? Obviously, what we have seen so far, when we have an exception, the program will stop running and will ignore the rest of the code. Is there any way that we skip on that part and then continue running our code? The answer is yes. We need to handle the exception by throwing the exception and then catching the exception and doing some sort of action when we catch that exception. Now, to throw an exception, the method will throw an exception, but it will not handle it. So it's going to look most probably the same as if you didn't do anything, but it's going to tell the caller that if you want to use this method, you will have to handle the exception, otherwise you'll not be allowed to use that. So this is the difference between just leaving it and just throwing the exception. So if you throw the exception from a method, if the method is supposed to or may have an exception, it will not allow the caller to use the method until the caller provides some handling for the exception itself. General syntax, if you want a method to throw an exception, is access level, return type, name, and then arguments. So this is just the method signature, but then we'll say throws some exception. Now, some exception is the exception class that you expect to have in your method's body. And we will see some examples on that. But before that, let's talk about catching an exception. because we will not be able to utilize that method unless we catch the exception. So we will use what we call a try-catch block. The general syntax for that is to write the keyword try, open up parentheses or curly brackets, and inside the curly brackets put the code that you suspect that this code may produce an exception. So if you have any suspicions that this code may provide a specific exception, you put that code in the try block, and then in the catch block you catch that exception that you suspect is going to happen, and in the curly brackets you will write whatever code that you want to execute when this exception happens. Now optionally we can have another block after this that's called finally, and we will talk about it in a minute. But then when I catch the exception, we said it's going to create an object of that specific exception type. So in this example you see catch some exception and then the letter E. So if I catch the exception, I will create an object of that specific type, and the object is E. Now with this object I have some methods that I can use with that object. Some of the useful ones are being print stack trace. So it's going to print on the console a stack trace of the exception. So what happened? Now we can also use the toString method, which will return a detailed error message of what happened. And we can also just say get message, that's going to return just a summary of the error message. Now again we can have a finally clause, which is an optional that's placed at the end of the try-catch block. Now this will contain a code to be executed before terminating the method. So if you catch the exception, execute your catch code, then you might want to do something before you get out. And usually this is used for closing files or network connections or some cleanup code. This will be included in the finally clause. So we will see some good use for that as well. Now let's try to apply what we talked about in here. Now we'll start with a simple one. We will start with division by zero. I created a class I called it Easy Calc, so it's an easy calculator class. For this easy calculator class, I'm not going to be doing some fancy codes. I will just get some numbers from the user and then I will try to do some kind of division. So I will first say system.out.println welcome to my calculator, and then I will ask the user to enter the first number. So it's going just to do division because the division is what's going to create an exception in this case. So system.out.println, please enter the first number. And then obviously I will need a scanner, so scanner SCN is equal to new scanner, and then system.n. Now your scanner can be SCN, can be any other name that you want, but I'm used to SCN. Obviously I will need to import the scanner class, so a shortcut for this with Eclipse is Control-Shift-O, or if you're using a Mac like I'm doing, it's going to be Command-Shift-O. Now I created my scanner object. Let me create an integer for my first number. So integer a is equal to scn dot next integer. This is going to give me the first integer. And what I need to do is I just need to copy this message and say please enter the second number. And since I already have a scanner object, I can just use that as well. Integer b is equal to scn dot next integer. Now I got my two integers. What I need to do is system.out.println, and I'll say the division is, and then what I will say is I'll say plus a over b. So a over b. So if you're not comfortable doing this, we can just do something that's going to be exactly the same. I can just say integer c is equal to a over b, and then do c in here. I'm having the parentheses here because if you do a plus sign with without the parentheses, then it's going to append that number. You can just go through the basics of strings to know what I'm exactly talking about. So now let's run this. Welcome to my calculator. Please enter my first number. It's 10. 10 divided by 2. The division is 5. We're gold. So let's do something else. 10. And then what I will say is 0. Exception. That's called arithmetic exception. Now let me show you something. If I have something after this, system.out.println, the rest of the code. So even if I run this now and say my first number is 10, my second number is 2, it's going to do the division and then going to execute the rest of the code. Now if I do this 10 and then 0, the rest of the code is not executed. Now what's happening here is this. This is causing the exception. Now let's try to catch this with what we call a try-catch block. Now although this line is the one that's creating the exception, I will put a try-catch block on the whole thing, and I will show you later why I'm doing this. But again, you can just surround this line by the try-catch because this is what's creating the exception. Now I'll say try, open up curly bracket, and then I will stop here and say catch. Now you can catch an exception like exception E, and this is going to catch any exception. So any exception that happens, it's going to print the same thing. I can just say system.out.println, there is an error. So system.out.println something like there is a problem. Now if I run this, enter my first number is 10, 0, it's going to say there is a problem, and then the rest of the code. Now what is the difference between this and having a specific exception? Let's do something else. If I say the first number is 10, the second number is A, there is a problem. So it's going to give you an exception, but it's not going to tell you exactly what that exception. Again, you can do this. You can say E dot print stack trace. Now this is going to give you more details. So a input mismatch exception, and it's going to give you all of that thing, and then it's going to execute the rest of the code as we can see right here. Now what I want to do is I want to catch the case where I have a 0. So 10, 0, or 100 in this case, and then 0. Arithmetic exception. So arithmetic exception is the name of the class that I'm trying to catch. So I can come here and say I'm catching arithmetic exception, and in this case I will go ahead and say system.out.println you cannot divide by 0, and save this. Now I'm catching my exception, so whenever I do any number and then say 0, you cannot divide by 0, and it's going to continue for the rest of my code. So now in this case, what's going to happen if I just put a letter? It's going to give me the input mismatch exception, like I'm not catching the exception, and it's not going to execute the rest of the code. Why is that? Because I'm not handling this exception, so it's going to terminate my application in this case. In the next video, we will see how we can put some more exceptions and catch more exceptions within the same try-catch block.